This morning we're considering a question. And the question is this: is he the one? Is he the one? It's a very important question. In fact, I would say it is the ultimate question for humanity. I wanted to make a picture of the film The Matrix. The film The Matrix came out in 1999. It's an old film, but it's still good. And in that film, there are lots of existential questions. There are lots of moral choices to be made by the characters. There are lots of challenges to people's perception. There are lots of philosophies and technologies which are explored. But in that film, there is a central question which goes throughout the film. Is Neo, the main character, the one? The one who is going to save the people of that society? The clue is in his name, Neo. If you rearrange the letters, it makes one. If he isn't, life goes on, and the status quo is unchanged. But if he is the one, everything changes. There's a character in the film called Morpheus, played by Lawrence Fishburne, and he's a sort of prophet-type character. And at one point, he says to Neo, "I've been looking for you the whole of my life." And so I want to ask you the question this morning. Who are you looking for? Are you looking for the one? And where are you looking? The central question for me is Jesus the one? If the answer is yes, and you believe it to be yes, everything changes. You will know that God is real. You will know that God loves you. You will know that he wants to know you. You will know that he's calling your name. You will know that he's calling you to come home. And on top of that, he offers forgiveness. He offers freedom. And he offers life in all its fullness. And if that's not enough, he promises eternal life. That's quite a package. Quite a package. So let's consider the question. Is he the one? Now, my starting point is this. This is not a new question. It's a question that people have been asking for over 2,000 years now. And people in the Bible were asking this question. And so I want to look at a couple of examples to start with in the Bible of people asking this question. So there's a guy early on in the New Testament called John the Baptist. You may have heard of him. He was Jesus' cousin. And in chapter 7 of Luke's Gospel, and verse 18, he's heard that all the things that Jesus is doing, Jesus is becoming popular. He's preaching his message, and he's performing miracles. And it says in verse 18, the disciples of John reported all these things to him. And John, calling two of the disciples to him, sent them to the Lord, saying, "Are you the one who is to come? Or shall we look for another?" Now that seems to me to be a bit of a strange question for John the Baptist to ask. And this is the reason. John was Jesus' cousin. He actually met him before he was born. When Mary, Jesus' mother, went to visit Elizabeth, John's mother, it says that the baby in her womb leapt for joy. That was John the Baptist. He recognized Jesus before he was born. Not only that, he's a preacher. Not only that, he's been baptizing people. Not only that, he had a following of people who were following him. And yet, he still says, "Are you the one?" What's going on? And Jesus' answer to these guys who go and asking the question is simple. It says in verse 21. It says, in that hour, 60 minutes, he, Jesus, healed many people of diseases and plagues and evil spirits, and on many who were blind he bestowed sight. And he answered them, the two that had gone to ask, "Go and tell John what you have seen and heard." Evidence. Go and tell John what you have seen and heard. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear. The dead are raised up, the poor have good news preached to them. And blessed is the one who is not offended by me. That's his answer to John the Baptist. Now, you could be forgiven for being sympathetic to John because that was quite near the beginning of Jesus' ministry. But I want to talk to you now about two other guys. Now, Jesus ministered for 3 years, and then he was crucified, and he rose from the dead. So Christians believe. And at the end of that 3 years of ministry, after his arrest, after his trial, after his crucifixion, after his resurrection, and appearing to many people. In other words, after the fulfillment of all that had been prophesied about him over the centuries had happened and been fulfilled, there were two men. And they were disciples of Jesus. They weren't just two ordinary blokes. They were disciples of Jesus. One of them was called Cleopas. And these two guys were walking down the road from Jerusalem to Emmaus. And this stranger comes alongside them, and they're talking about what's been going on in Jerusalem with the death of Jesus and what all's happened. And he says to them, "What are you talking about?" And they don't recognize who is standing next to them. It says he was hidden from them. And so these guys who have seen all this evidence, seen all the fulfillment of prophecy, know the story. Well, surely, they know he's the one. And yet, in this story, in Luke chapter 24, verse 21, this is what they say. They say, "But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel." We had hoped. In other words, they're still not sure. And so he walks on with them, and he sits and he eats with them. And then he breaks the bread. And in the breaking of the bread, their eyes are opened, and they see he is Jesus. He is the one. And that everything they have heard about him and know of him is true. So that's 2,000 years ago. Come forward to today. How can we know the answer to that question? It seems that it's a bit more of a struggle to believe and to find the answer to that question than you might think. If even people who were with him were asking the question, even people who were related to him were asking that question, how can we know that for ourselves? The answer is simple. We know the answer to that question by faith. Not a blind faith, but a step of faith based on good evidence. This is not a question that someone else can answer for you. You have to find the answer for yourself. There's no second-hand answers. And the question is, are you going to take the blue pill or are you going to take the red pill? Some of you don't know what I'm talking about. That's all right. Take one, everything stays the same. Take the other, there's a possibility of everything changing. I've got 3 pointers for you this morning. These are not full answers, just 3 suggestions and pointers of different sorts of evidence that will help you to answer this question. And I want to consider these briefly. The first is that Jesus claimed to be the one. The second is that he demonstrated that he was the one. And the third is that he proved he is the one. So let's look at the first one. Jesus claimed in his words to be the one. People say that he never did. People say he didn't actually say he was God. But if we look at the scriptures, we see that he did. In John chapter 10, verse 30, he said, "I and the Father," in other words, God, are one. Jesus claimed unity with God, which his listeners at that time understood and interpreted that he was claiming deity, causing them to attempt to stone him for blasphemy. They knew what he was saying. We might say, well, it's old language. They knew. Not only that, in John chapter 8:58, he said, before Abraham was, I am. He used the name that God had given himself in Exodus chapter 3, verse 14, to say that he was the same. In other words, Jesus claimed pre-existence and identity as God. Again, prompting his listeners to try and kill him. Third one, Jesus claimed authority over the Sabbath. John chapter 5, verses 17 and 18. By calling God his own Father, he made himself equal with God, leading to further accusations of blasphemy. Not only can we trust the sayings of Jesus as he spoke those words, but there is contextual evidence about what he said as well. The reactions of the Jewish leaders who wanted to stone him for making himself God indicate that they understood exactly what he was saying. They understood his claims clearly. Not only that, there are divine attributes in what Jesus is saying. He claimed authority to judge nations in Matthew 25 and to be with his followers always, Matthew 28. And not only that, in John's Gospel we have a number of sayings that Jesus used. We sung one this morning. I am the way, the truth, the life. Not I am a way, a truth, a life, but I am the truth, the way, the life. No room for misunderstanding there. He also said, I am the bread of life. He's asserting his divine nature. I'm just giving you snippets here. I must move on. So not only does his words say that he is the one, his actions demonstrated that he is the one. Jesus demonstrates his divinity throughout the Gospels through divine actions and the alignment with the Hebrew Scriptures. Here's some demonstrations. He forgave sins. Only God can forgive sins. Everyone knows that. But in Mark 2, Jesus did it. That's a prerogative for God and God alone. He had authority over nature and death. He demonstrated divinity through miracles such as calming storms and raising Lazarus from the dead and raising himself from the dead. Not only that, he accepted worship as God, just as Thomas declared, surely you are God. He didn't say, no, Thomas, you're wrong there. Don't put me equal with God. John 20:28. And they also displayed divine attributes. Omniscience. He knew what people were thinking. And he knew future events. No ordinary man can do that. He also claimed the presence of God. Where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there I will be in their midst. And he promised that he would be with his followers always. His actions and statements caused contemporaries at the time to understand he was claiming equality with God. That's evidence. Evidence that Jesus is the one. But the most conclusive thing and the crucial thing that proves or disproves whether Jesus is the one is what? Just shout out, resurrection. Did Jesus rise from the dead or not? If he didn't, forget it. If he did, wow, that's it. The case for the resurrection rests on historical arguments, including the documentation of the crucifixion, the discovery of the empty tomb, the reports of the post-death appearances to disciples, and the transformation of witnesses despite persecution. Scholars often highlight, as they look at this area, the rapid spread of faith in Jesus immediately following his death and resurrection, and the conversion of skeptics like Paul, who was a persecutor of the church but then became an apostle. There are even modern skeptics. There's a guy called Frank Morrison who wrote a book, Who Moved the Stone? And then there's a guy called Lee Strobel who wrote a book called The Case for Christ and became a film. Both of whom set out to disprove the resurrection. Both of whom came to believe it as they looked at the evidence, at the facts. Evidence changes things. And so some of the key arguments to the resurrection very briefly. Firstly, the empty tomb. The tomb was found empty by the women very early on the third morning, and their testimony was unusual, because in that era, the testimony of women wasn't generally accepted. And so if you wanted to make up a story that everyone would believe that was a made-up story, you would not choose the women as your first witnesses. And that in itself points to a truthful account rather than a manufactured story. Not only that, the tomb's location was known and the authorities could not produce the body, which would have stopped the movement. And then what about all these times that Jesus appeared to people after he was raised from the dead? There were multiple individuals and groups. The disciples, Mary Magdalene, those on the road to Emmaus that we've already talked about, reported encountering a physically tangible yet transformed Jesus, including conversations and meals eating together. He was not a ghost. And then there's the transformation of the apostles. The disciples who fled in fear were radically transformed and started preaching the resurrection in the same city where they were previously terrified. And many of them ended their lives in martyrdom. Surely, if it wasn't true, it was just easy to say, actually, sorry, I got it all wrong. But they didn't. They died for their faith. And then there's skeptics like Paul. He was a persecutor of Christians, but he became a firm believer, claiming to have literally encountered the risen Jesus on the road. Final one. The church grew so strong that began an oral tradition of creeds and testimony and confessions, like those we read in 1 Corinthians 15. And these creeds and testimonies originated within months or a few years of the event. And scholars argue that this is far too early for legend to have replaced historical fact. It's another piece of evidence. And then there's a historical context. Crucifixion records. Secular historians such as Josephus and Tacitus acknowledged Jesus existed and was executed. Medical evidence. The analysis by the Journal of the American Medical Association indicated that the severity of crucifixion combined with the spear wound ensures Jesus was dead before being removed from the cross. He did not faint. He didn't swoon. The Romans knew how to kill people. They were experts in killing people in the most horrible ways, and they killed Jesus. And then there's a failure of alternative theories. Alternative explanations such as the disciples stole the body, the swoon theory, hallucinations, are frequently argued by people but are less plausible than the truth that Jesus raised from the dead. The concluding piece of evidence that says he is the one. Now you can explore the evidence and you can believe all that is intellectually true, but that's not enough, because that will not affect your life. Faith affects lives. Real living faith affects lives. Horatio Spafford, you may not have heard of him. He was an American. Born in 1828, died in 1888. He was a prominent American lawyer, and he was also a Presbyterian church elder, and he was a businessman. And it would be fair to say that he didn't have it easy in his life. I want to tell you some things about his life. In 1871, Spafford lost his 4-year-old son. His 4-year-old son died. Shortly after that was the Great Fire of Chicago, and all his real estate investments were destroyed. He was going through a tough time. After that, he decided to send his wife and his 4 daughters to Europe. And in 1873, his wife and Anna and their 4 daughters, Annie, Maggie, Bessie, and Tanetta, boarded a ship to Europe, the SS Ville de Havre. The ship collided with another vessel and sank in 12 minutes. Anna survived. The daughters didn't. And when she reached Europe, she sent him a telegram, 2 words: saved alone. That's a tough time, isn't it? And so Horatio Spafford decided to go to be with his wife in Europe. And while traveling to meet his grieving wife, the ship's captain came to speak to him at the point where the ship had sunk and told him this is where it happened. And amidst his unimaginable grief, he wrote a poem. This is how it starts. When peace, like a river, attendeth my way, when sorrows, like sea billows roll, whatever my lot, thou hast taught me to say, it is well with my soul. And that poem goes on. It's amazing, the words that he wrote there in the midst of his grief. And a few years later, Horatio's friend Philip Bliss, a renowned gospel composer, put music to that poem, and it became a hymn that has endured to today, that strengthens and encourages people. And so we come back to the question, is Jesus the one? Some people say that Christianity is a fairy tale. But I say to them, a fairy tale doesn't strengthen you through adversity like the ones that Horatio Spafford went through. I say to you that science fiction films don't give you strength like the adversity that Horatio Spafford went through. I say to you that being a good person and working hard, as good as that is, does not give you the strength to get through that adversity. But faith gets you through that adversity. Not just any faith, but faith in the one, in Jesus. And so, how do we respond to that? Are you considering that question? Have you been considering it for years, maybe? Well, I'd just say to you this, a few things. If you're thinking about that question, if you struggled with it for years, keep coming to church. Keep being part of a community. That's a good place to explore faith. And take time to explore the most important question that you can think about. 42 or 3 years ago, I was considering that question myself. As a young man in my early 20s, you can work out my age from that I'd never encountered Christians. I'd never been brought up in a Christian family. I didn't know what Christianity was until I met a person who started to tell me. And I started to read the Bible, to read the New Testament for myself. And I was faced with this question. This was the key question. Is Jesus the one? Because if he is, my life had to change. 40 odd years ago. I don't know what my life would have been like if I hadn't found the answer to that question. But I do know it wouldn't have been as exciting. It wouldn't have been as fulfilling. It wouldn't have been as dangerous. It wouldn't have been as expanding. It wouldn't have been loads and loads of things that it's been. In fact, it might have been quite boring. But I did find the answer to that question. And if you have found the answer to that question, I urge you, tell someone. Tell someone.